let's learn how to create this stencil effect in Spark AR. Okay, so I'm here in Spark AR just with the new blank project. Now before we start building our effect, there are a few things we're going to need. The first thing, of course, is some background on which to put our stencil effect. So if you need some images, you can come to Pixabay, and I'm just going to be using some wood images. So just search for wood, and here are a lot of good images you can use. So if we click into here, we can download an image. It's all free to use, free to download. Once I did that, I just cropped them to a vertical format, 9:16 aspect ratio. So I just got a few of those, so I'll import those in just a moment. The other image that I recommend using, but isn't required, is an image of random noise. So if we take a look, it's just random white, black, gray. If you don't have random noise, in the description of the video, there's a link to the written version of this tutorial, and I provided this image there. So once you have your background images and then your optional noise image, go ahead and import those. So I'm just going to drag them over into here. And now we have our textures. All right, so now that we have those, let's go ahead and start building our stencil effect. Now I'm going to do the entire thing in the patch editor. So I'm going to come up to the view menu, show hide patch editor, and let's just lift that up, fill the whole screen, and I'll make our preview a little larger. Okay, so let's click on our device, and we're going to create a render pass. So the render pass is we can take our input. So we're going to start with our camera texture. We're going to apply some effects to it, overlay it onto our background images, and that will come into the scene render pass, and that will be what gets displayed. So now that we have all this, let's go ahead and start our effect. So we do have our background images. We'll load those in just a moment. But the basic stencil effect is we need to take whatever the camera sees, convert it to just white and black, so some sort of threshold, and then just overlay it in some way. But there are going to be a few other little tricks we do to make it look a little more realistic, a little better blended. So before I start adding anything here, I'm going to import some patches from the AR library. So I'm going to add asset, go to AR library. Now the first one I'm going to add is a blur patch. So let's search for blur. Here we go. And let's import this. Now the blur, we're going to add a slight blur just to help smooth out the lines. Because when we threshold the image, it's just going to, based on the value, either be white or black. The blur, if we add just a little bit, we'll maintain definition, but we'll get rid of some of the jagged edges, make it look a little more smooth. So that's why we want that. Now we also want a luminance. So this is essentially going to just take our image, convert it to a grayscale version. Now I think technically we can create this effect without the luminance, but that's just the way I did it, so I'm going to stick with it. And then I'm also going to bring in a tritone. Now what this does is it will take the image and convert it to just 3 colors, hence the name tritone. So here in the example we have red, orange, yellow. You can see this image is all red, orange, or yellow. So we're going to use this, but we're going to convert it to just output 2 colors, black and white. So now that we have these imported, let's go ahead and start hooking them up. So I'm going to drag in the blur. Let's go ahead and hook our camera texture into that. And then if we plug this into the background and take a look, you'll see we get an error. The reason for that is we can't directly plug any transformed textures into the scene render pass, we need to add a shader render pass. So everything will flow into this, and then this will flow into our scene render pass. So let's move everything over a bit. So we'll come into here and into here. So we have a little preview here. I don't think we really need that open right now, so I'll just close it to save some space. And you can see here we have a slight blurring going on. So we can increase this amount if we want. But I'm going to keep it at 0.5 for now. We don't need a lot of blur, we just want enough to kind of smooth things out. Alright, so let's slide over. So now we have the blur. I'm going to do the luminance. So I just want a grayscale version. Alright, so slightly blurred, grayscale, all good. Let's slide these over a bit. And let's add the tritone. And this is how we're going to get that thresholded effect. So let's plug the luminance into the texture. We'll plug that into the shader render pass. Now we don't want 3 colors. So the highlight color, I'm going to set to white. The midtone color, I'll set to white. Shadow color, I'll set to black. And then the highlight threshold, it doesn't matter because we just have white and white. But the shadow threshold, this will be the value that determines how much black or how much white is in there. So we have a low value and we have more white. If we go a little higher, we have more black in there. So somewhere between 0.2, 0.4 seems to work fine. I'll go with 0.3 for my threshold. And if we want, we can cycle through a few different characters, different skin tones, different hair colors, and just kind of see how that looks. So you want to balance that shadow threshold to make sure this effect is looking okay on all different types of people. It looks like 0.3 is working pretty well. All right, so this is kind of basic stencil effect. So let's go ahead and overlay it onto our background. So let's pull in our images. So I have a few different ones. So I want to be able to tap to cycle through. So I have a screen tap, and I want this to go into a counter. So each time we tap, we'll count. I'll change the maximum to 4 because I only have 4 images. And then I'll grab an option picker. I'll have the count going into the option. I'll change this from number to texture. And then I'm just going to choose my images. So there are my 4 background images. And now to create our effect, let's just move this stuff over. Let's add a multiply patch. And we'll take our, let's keep the shader in the pass over there. We want to bring our tritone output into the top input, our background into the bottom. And now if we plug it in, we are getting our effect. If I change this to simulate touch, we can tap through and see our different background. So this is kind of a very basic stencil effect. So we could call it quits here, but it is a little harsh. So it's just a solid black overlaid onto a background. Now let's go ahead and make this blend in a little better. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the shadow color slightly. So if we remember our original effect, we have white and black. So when we multiply, so you can think of the color white as having a value of 1. And if you multiply something by 1, you get that same value back. And then black you can think of as being a value of 0. Anything times 0 is 0. And so if we look at our multiplied effect again, wherever we have the white, we are seeing our background. And then anywhere we have our shadow color black, we're seeing just black because we're multiplying by 0. So if we change the shadow color, let's take it up a little bit to like a dark brown. You can start to see the background show through a little more. So it's still darkening because we have a darker color, but it's non-zero, so we're ending up with just black. And being able to see the background helps sell the, I guess, illusion that we have maybe painted or drawn, or if it's wood, maybe we did some wood burning to kind of create that effect. And so this does a lot as far as just helping integrate our effect with the background. But on the more plain backgrounds especially, you can see that our stencil effect is all kind of uniform. We are seeing the background, but it's just kind of like a flat color. And so that's where our noise texture is going to come into play. So I'm just going to drag this in. And what we're going to do is we're going to blend some noise into our stencil effect to help break it up a little bit. It is going to be subtle, but is gonna help a little bit, kind of break up the uniformity and make it feel a little more natural. So this part is optional. We already have a pretty good effect here, but let's go ahead and add our noise texture in. So I'm going to add a blend. So I want to take our noise, blend it with our stencil effect. So I'm going to bypass our background just for a little bit so we can see what's going on. So blend mode normal, we see just the noise. If we take this to multiply, now you can see we have some noise added. But the problem is we have noise on the background where we want it to be just white. And so if we hook this all up, you can see it works, but now I've added noise to the background, and we don't necessarily want that. So let's slide these patches over a little bit, and let's restrict our noise to just the dark part of the stencil. So that's not too hard to do. Now we're just going to take a mix. I'm going to mix our noisy stencil effect with the color white. So I'm just going to put a value of 1 there. And then for the alpha, this is kind of the mix factor. So if it is 0, this mix factor, we'll see the top input. If it's 1, we'll see this middle input. And so that ends up doing is we get just white, and then we get our noise mixed in on the dark color. Now technically we aren't mixing exactly 0 to 1 because we don't have black here. But since we have a dark color, it still works well enough. So that might have been a lot of information really quick. So what we're doing is we're just taking our noisy image and we're using our stencil effect itself to mix it back in with just the color white to make sure our background here is just plain white. And now if we use that for the overlaid parts, we plug it into our shader interpass. Now we have our final effect. So it's a lot harder to tell that the noise is in there when we have kind of a busier background, but it does help break it up, I feel, and it looks a lot more natural. So it's still not like a perfect stencil effect, but it is much better than just a black and white being overlaid onto a background. And that is all of the effect. So feel free, you can play around with your tritone, you can play around with the blur. So if we have no blur, we have kind of more definition in some areas along the lines. The more blur we have, you can see we still see that it's a face, but smoothed out a lot. I think a value of 0.5 works pretty well if I can type correctly. So just adjust that to your liking, just the tritone to your liking, and the blending. So there's not a lot to it. It's pretty simple effects. We just blur, grayscale threshold, add a little bit of noise, overlay it onto our background.